that experience. But tonight we're focused on the book of John and his point of view of those things. And there's a couple of other interesting things that I want to share with you that come up as well. All right, so let's jump right into the book of John, chapter 18. And when we last picked up in the previous chapters, he was having his final words with his disciples. In fact, the past several chapters from chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 all had to do with his final words to his disciples, final instructions, some more deeper insight about his identity. Remember, John is all about who Jesus is. And so in those chapters, he goes even deeper to explaining who he is and his relationship with the Father. And so as much as to go as far as to suggest, to imply that they were the same, that they were completely in union, and that they would come and they would be together throughout. And so he goes into that and a whole lot more. He talks about what's going to happen after he leaves. He encourages them. He talks to them about the promise of the Holy Spirit that was to come. All those things happen in those chapters. John spends a good deal of time, more so than any of the others, really elaborating on those discussions. Now we're in chapter 18, and they have left and they're heading to the Garden of Gethsemane. And when they go there, of course, we know what takes off from there. So Jesus had spoken these words. When Jesus had spoken these words in verse 1, it says, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So the one thing we see different about Gethsemane is that John does not get into Jesus' specific prayers to his Father in the garden. We find that the other three do spend a good deal of time there. John really doesn't spend time talking about his prayer in the garden. What he does talk about in chapter 17 is his prayer for his disciples and for us. And we talked about that last time. And he focuses on that prayer of Jesus lifting us up and preparing us for when he leaves and believing in unity. But John doesn't talk about what happened in Gethsemane. The thing I would say about this, comment about this, is that John is really focused on showing the deity of Christ versus the humanity of Christ. And when you read in the other descriptions of what happens in the garden, you see more of the humanity of Christ, where he's challenging, or he's not challenging, but he's testing, whether this is something he really is willing to do, has to do. He's struggling in his humanity for what he knows is about to come. The one thing we know from observing all of these writings is that he knows. He's very much aware for a good period of time in advance what is happening and what is about to happen. He walks into this trap, if you will. He allows these things to transpire. And in Gethsemane is where he has that last conversation with God, perhaps the last of many, we don't know, where he really tests, do I really have to do this? Is this really necessary? Is there any other way? But then he yields himself to the will of his Father, as he always has, and he goes forth. And so in the Garden of Gethsemane, having placed himself right in this common space where he knows Judas, and we saw a couple of weeks ago that Judas had gone out, and Jesus knew he had gone out. He tells him, go do what you must do. So he knows where Judas is headed. He knows that Judas is aligning to meet him in this garden. And here he goes, right into the den of the lion and preparing for what's going to happen. And so it says in verse 3, then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. And Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, whom are ye seeking? Now, it's interesting in verse 3 says they come, with all these lanterns, torches, weapons. They're coming just in case there's a fight. They realize that Jesus has a great following at this point, and they do have some concerns that, and they had them before, that if they tried to take him during the day, there might be some kind of a riot, a rebellion, that the people might actually take his side instead of their side, being the Pharisees. And so they're coming intentionally at an off time to do what they're going to do and to have as little resistance as possible. This is why the whole trial takes place essentially overnight, over one night. People don't even know that this is going on, most people. But they sent these people out to get them. They're prepared for any kind of battle that might need to be taken place in order to get them and to seize them and get them back into their possession, where then they knew they would have control. But there is no battle. Right? Jesus is there with his disciples, and he does not resist this. And so it tells us here that Jesus, knowing all things that would come upon him, again, he already knows, went forward and said to them, "Whom are ye seeking?" And they answered, "Jesus of Nazareth," or Jesus the Nazarene. And Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him also stood with them. Now, when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. There was something about not just what he said or how he said it, but there was something in the atmosphere that caused these men that were there ready to fight, work as soldiers, armed, prepared, when all he said was, "I am he," and they fell back to the ground. And then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I've told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way." It says that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." Now, remember, he said that when he prayed for them in the previous chapter. He says, "Except the son of perdition," which is Judas. And so then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" So this reflects back to what we just described in terms of the dialogue that went on in the garden between Jesus and his Father. He asks him, "Lord, is there any way I can not drink this cup? Is there any way this cup can be taken away from me?" And he comes from that prayer and that time of solitude with God, affirming or confirming that, well, probably affirming that, yes, this is something that he needed to do, he needed to take on. And so now what John shows of it is this final state of Jesus after having that dialogue to say, "Yep, I've got to do this. I can't allow it to just go away." Many times, think about it, as we go through things, we look at certain things, and if there's a way out, we're ready to take that way out, and we just call that God. But Jesus knew what his assignment was. And he knew, sometimes we think our assignments are all the best things, right? To go through the good stuff, to say, to experience things that are victorious. But Jesus shows us there's a time when we have to go through some things which aren't necessarily what we want to do, don't necessarily make us happy. And we are intended to go through it. There are times we go through the valley, and it is the will of God, because it leads to something else. The good thing we understand about the valleys is that the valleys don't lead to nothing. If God sends us through a valley, it's for a purpose. There's a reason. We may not understand it fully. We may not even see it all, because it may not all be directly related to us. But God, when he allows us to go through difficult times, there is a purpose for it. And so Jesus now has accepted the fact that this is God's will for me. This is my destiny to take this cup. I believe that there are times in our lives when we have to come to that same realization, that there are some days, there are some situations, some times, they may not be fun, they may not be what we want, but they're the will of the Lord, and we have to be willing to accept that cup. And so he acknowledges this, he accepts it in his life. Now, let me just say, before we go too much further, there is an interesting contrast that's coming up, and we'll talk about a little bit more further down, between what we have seen of Judas and what we see of Simon Peter. It's interesting. It hadn't really come to my mind like this before, but I actually saw something earlier today that brought this out, and it got me meditating on this, and we'll talk about this. Never thought about contrasting Judas and Peter, but it's coming out, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit. Let's go to verse 12 now. It says, Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. We've heard the name Caiaphas before. Some of you may have heard it outside even the study. But Caiaphas is the one that is the high priest of this time. And he is the one that is really calling the shots and has made the decision and determination. It's vital, it's important for us to deal with this Jesus and deal with him now. So Jesus first goes to Annas, his father-in-law, and now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. This is a powerful statement. We read it before. It comes from the 11th chapter after, excuse me, after, very sorry, after Lazarus had been risen from the dead. Jesus talks about, excuse me, not Jesus, but Caiaphas brings this up because they are so overwhelmed at the time about how the people are following after Jesus, especially after this incident. And so in the scribes, the Pharisees, discussing this situation and how overwhelming people were driving after Jesus and driving away from them. They were losing control. They were losing the direction of the people. And so he says this in John chapter 11. Let's just go back to this just for a moment, because it really is a powerful statement. It says, and one of them, Caiaphas, being the high priest that year, right? So they would rotate this high priest responsibility around amongst them. And this, I suspect that Annas, his father, had probably been high priest previously at some point, if not just before that, at some point he had held the role as well. Caiaphas is the priest for this year. He's standing in this position. And this is powerful because he is in the position of high priest. We've talked from time to time in the past about the fact that when someone is standing in a certain position, even if they're not a good person, even if they're not all they should be, even if they're in sin, the fact that they stand in that position is relevant. David would not touch Saul because he was the anointed of God. He was the king, put there by God. Now, Saul was in a bad way, spiritually in all kinds of ways. But David would not touch the anointed one. We have to be conscious and careful of this because so often we treat these situations, these people, as if they're just like another friend, another buddy. We talk them down. You see people that are doing all kind of stuff. And these days, people just love to do that, especially with men and women of God. If they do anything wrong, man, we are ready to fire them up, to talk about them as being ungodly and whatever the case may be. You have to be careful and conscious of speaking against or putting your hand against, even figuratively, someone who's in a position that God has placed them in, an anointed position. Be careful. You can get your own self in trouble. So Caiaphas is in this position, and we see that because of that, what he says has meaning. There's a value to it. He says, being the high priest that year, he says to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that not the whole nation should perish. So Caiaphas is in a wrong place in his mind, but he states something which really becomes a prophetic because he said it. God put him in the position that he's in, and God used him to speak a word that would be prophetic about his son. God used Pharaoh, and God used many other kings who were in certain positions, and even though they may have been corrupt and ungodly, God used them for his own purposes. And so Caiaphas makes this statement that one man should die so that the whole nation doesn't have to perish. And he's thinking about this in terms of preservation of their beliefs and their religion. But the reality of it is, it's not just about that. Because he's sitting in the position of high priest, he's speaking about the sacrifice that God is making through his son and doesn't even realize what he's saying. It says in 51, now this he did not say on his own authority, But being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. So John brings this out, expresses to us, makes it very clear that what's being said and done here by Caiaphas, he doesn't even realize it, but because of the position he's in, God is using him to speak a word that would carry power in terms of what was going to happen. It's a prophetic word. So now when we go to where we are in chapter 18, I was going to elaborate more on that. I'm just debating whether to just let it go. But the point is, Caiaphas is saying something without even realizing what he's saying because of his position, but it's being released in the word of God. Now we go back to chapter 18 where Jesus is being captured now and taken captive. And we see this whole concept again continues itself in here. And as it talks about Caiaphas, the one who's a high priest that year, verse 14, now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. So that's the reference that John is making here. And John emphasizes again because he realizes this is a prophetic statement that had taken place. Now, Peter begins his denial. Jesus had already warned Peter. He says, you're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows. And so Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now, anytime you see this kind of writing, third party, it's the author that is speaking of this. And so this is John referring to himself. And so it says Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did John. We see John is there all the way through the cross. So now the disciple was known, this disciple meaning John, was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. So John is here and he is a witness throughout this entire event. While others talked about it from a ways or a distance, Matthew and Mark, they were there through Gethsemane, they kind of disappear. Luke got the story later on, third party. John is a witness that was there throughout this entire occasion, all the way through to the death of Jesus on the cross. Peter stood at the door outside, then the other disciple. So let me back up just a little bit. He was known to the high priest and he went in. So John was allowed to go into the courtyard where this trial of Jesus was taking place. This is in the Sanhedrin court, if you will. Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, John, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. So Peter now gets to come in. And so Peter's in the courtyard with John, and they are observers, but they're not identifying who they are. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, you are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? Reverse the way it's asked, but he's asking, you're also one of the disciples, aren't you? He says, I'm not. Denial number 1. Now the servants and officers who made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. So Peter now is inside the gate with John, and he's basically there and just, just kind of hanging out as all this is going on. So then the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spoke only openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues in the temple where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. Now, there are other versions of this in Matthew, Mark, Luke that describe that Jesus didn't say anything, both here and before Pilate. And there are times when he goes silent, and there are times when he says certain things. And I think in all cases, at some point, Jesus, when he's with the Sanhedrin, says nothing while he's being accused. And they ultimately come back to him and they question and challenge him, and that's when he acknowledges himself as being the Son of God to them. And then similar with Pilate, there's times when he says nothing, and there's other times he has a conversation. So it says, why do you ask me? He says, I've asked those who've heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? Now remember, he's still talking at this point, probably to Annas. I'm not sure if he's talking actually to Annas or Caiaphas at this point. Actually, he's still talking to Annas. I thought so. And he's going to send them yet to Caiaphas. So that's why I said Annas was probably former high priest. So he says, do you Answer the high priest like that. And Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? Again, it would make sense that John would have a little bit more detail of the description of what was said back and forth because he was right there. Matthew, Mark, Luke were not there in the middle of this courtyard the way that he is. And so he adds some things that Jesus did say in the midst of this. So now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, you are not also one of his disciples, are you? I got it right that time. He denied it and said, I am not. Strike two. And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off. Now remember, we just had the sword incident with Peter trying to fight and resist and defend Christ. And Christ basically shut him down on that and healed the man. So a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off said, did I not see you in the garden with them? And Peter denied him again, a third time. And immediately a rooster crowed. And so the prophecy that Jesus had given to him, the word he spoke to him, that said, you're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows. Now, the cock crows, as you get in the early morning, for those of you who never had roosters around, it's not sunrise, it's well before sunrise that they start. So it may be like 4 in the morning, something like that, and so the cock now starts crowing, and Peter's reminded of this. And so Peter now goes into this guilt. And it says elsewhere, this is where Peter leaves. He had been in the court area with what was taking place here. But when this happens, the cock crows, and it says elsewhere that at that moment, Jesus looked at him and he saw Jesus eye to eye when this happens. And so when that happens, his guilt causes him to leave. He runs away. And so Peter leaves the scene. John stays there, but Peter leaves the scene. By the time Jesus is actually crucified, the only ones you really see are John and the ladies, some of the Marys and some of the others that are around. The disciples have all fled. They've all gone their ways. This becomes a major point of guilt to Peter. And this takes us to the analogy I wanted to share with you, the comparison between Judas and Peter. It's an interesting thing when you look at both of these. Both Judas and Peter failed Jesus during this time. And the question that was asked that I saw earlier today, again, just randomly, was does Judas go to hell and Peter go to heaven? And if so, why? If both of them failed, both of them turned on Jesus. Judas was the one that set him up to be taken. But Peter, here in the midst of him, does not defend him at this point. He actually denies him and runs away. So what's the difference between the end point of both of these people? And let's just, again, save an argument at this point that Judas falls away and he does not make it to heaven, that he goes to hell, that he is lost, right? Versus Peter, who we're going to see next week, is restored even from this position of guilt. He feels guilty. He feels not worthy. He runs away. He ends up going back to his life as a fisherman. All this time through which Jesus now goes through all this and dies, his mind is messed up. So what's the difference between these two and the failure that they made? So let's analyze it a little bit. First of all, Judas, the Bible tells us that he was deceived by the devil. The Bible tells us that he was in a position where he first of all, we read it a few weeks ago, where he had allowed the devil to put the concept in him. But then later he had gone even further and he had been filled with the devil entered into him. During this time that they're in the upper room, he goes through this transition where, the devil puts this concept in him to betray him. He accepts that. Even before then, he agrees to betray him. And then he goes on even further now. And now he He gets filled with the devil, and he goes out and do this. How does he get, first of all, to the place that he's in? Well, first of all, it starts with this aspect of what was already in his heart. And this is important for us to grab, is that there's already something going on inside of him that the devil utilizes. And in both cases, there's something going on that the devil is able to attach to. So I hope you understand why I'm taking you here, because it's important for us to understand that the devil attaches to things that are already in us, and he will use them against you. So you need to understand. This is why I tell people, you have to understand your own weaknesses. You need to understand your own vulnerabilities. You can't just deny them, because those things will be used against you. And so you have to be understanding of the fact that what's going on in your own heart. And so Judas has this issue going on inside of him where he's looking for revenge. He's looking for there to be a takeover. He despises the Romans, and what he's looking for from the scriptures is this concept of a Messiah that will come and overtake and bring destruction to their enemies. He's almost bloodthirsty, if you will, with this concept of overtaking their enemies in the Romans. And so when he sees Jesus, he sees him as being the aspect of this that will cause this destruction, if you will, of the enemies of the Jews. And he's frustrated. That's the reason he's hanging around, by the way. I mean, Judas is not the coolest of people, right? He's somewhat of a con man. He's somewhat of a crook. But he's hanging around Jesus because he believes ultimately Jesus is going to take over. And when he takes over, then he's going to be in charge with the rest of them, right? So he wants to be in on it early on. And so as this is taking place, he's frustrated that it's not happening. He's frustrated that it's taken so long. And he decides the best thing to do is to push the incident. And so when you see him, the reason that the devil is able to utilize him, he's able to utilize this self-desire that he has for what he wants to see happen. And he convinces him, look, you got to take some action. You got to get involved. It's that still voice that will take advantage of where your heart is and move you in a place which is outside of God's will. And even as we've seen with the Pharisees and their willingness to compromise the values of God to get the end result that they think should be happening. That's what we saw with Caiaphas and those people. That's why they took Jesus captive. That's why they were willing to kill, to commit murder, even though that's outside of the law. They're willing to justify what they're doing for what they think is the good rationale, a bigger picture. You got to be careful that the devil will not take you a place that you're not supposed to be, that's outside of God's will, and you just begin to feel like it's okay. This person deserved it, right? I deserved it. He'll use things that are inside of you. So you got to make sure that inside you are right. Judas goes through this. He is led down this path. He surrenders himself to what ends up being the path of the devil. And he doesn't really expect that Jesus is going to be killed. And so that's why as he watches and observes what happens here, he's kind of surprised and he realizes he's deceived, because his discussion, his negotiation with the Sanhedrin was not for Jesus to be killed, is for him to be taken captive. And he figures if he pushes the envelope and Jesus is taken captive, he's going to have to rise up because he can't die, right? He's the Messiah. It'll be time for him to rise up and overcome all that, right? So that is what he is expecting. And it doesn't go anywhere near the direction that he thought it was going to go. So now he's frustrated and he's guilty. And the devil has taken over his thoughts and directions. And now the devil does what he does. After he has deceived you and caused you to go in the wrong direction, then he holds you accountable for it. He makes you feel guilty for it. And so now he brings on the guilt. And as a result of that, Judas ends up surrendering his own life. He takes his own life because he can't stand now the overwhelming oppression that the devil is putting on him. That's the way the devil would do you. And so you have to be conscious of those things. So he ends up in one place. Peter, on the other side of this, is in a similar funk, if you will, because he has, but his gets there for another reason. Peter has a confidence in himself. He feels like he's powerful enough that he will stand and die. He will fight to the death for Jesus. He absolutely believes that. When he says that prior, he's not lying, he's not exaggerating. He believes exactly that. I will die for you. And Jesus says, you're going to deny me 3 times. The interesting thing here is how Jesus, in essence, ends up humbling Peter, because Peter says, no, I can do this. I'm ready. And so he's ready to fight. And Jesus says, nope, you can't fight. You can't fight this in the flesh. You're going to have to surrender to what God is doing here. And when he can't fight it out of his own strength, then he finds out he doesn't have any strength. And so when he can't raise his arms and raise his sword and go to battle and die in battle for Christ, he does not have the strength to be humble with Christ and to acknowledge him and to perhaps even die with him on the cross. If he really wanted to be with him to the end, he could have said, yeah, I'm one of his disciples too. Whatever you're going to do to him, do to me. But instead of that, now, because he can't do it in his own strength, he has no strength, and he realizes that. And so he goes a whole nother direction here of finding out that what's not in him. God exposed to him his own weakness, his own vulnerability. And that's why he ran off, he was embarrassed, and Jesus had to restore him. So 2 men, both of them, had been on the outs with Jesus in terms of representing him, but they went down 2 different paths. One allowed the corruption that was inside of him to be used by the devil to take him down a path which led to his guilt and led to his surrendering his own life. The other one, God exposed him and allows him to realize what was and was not truly inside of him, and the fact that he had to submit and surrender himself to God. And that was important for the ministry that he was going to carry. Because unless he surrendered himself, he would not truly be able to represent God the way he should. Certainly not out of his own power, not out of his own ability. And so that needed to happen for him to become the servant of God that God wanted him to be. Now the Bible tells us, I believe it's in the book of James, he says, when you're tempted, realize that you're not, God doesn't tempt any of us, but we are tempted out of our own lusts. And when those lusts have consumed, then they ultimately become sin and lead to death. This is what happened to Judas. Judas had his own desires, and the devil just used them. We've got to realize and be protective of the fact that the devil knows what's going on. He knows your weaknesses. He knows your vulnerabilities. You need to know them because you need to know that the devil will use them against you. You need to know when something is hitting the pitch, right? And you need to be familiar with the fact that, that's an area of mine, right? God, help me build that up. Help me strengthen that up. I've had issues in the past here. And for all of us, it's different. You know, there's some things that I would never do. I never have. That's just not my issue. But we all have an area of vulnerability and all have an area of weakness. It may be a temptation. It may be a hurt. It may be a pain. It may be experience of the past. It may be whatever the case is. But you got to know what's inside of you to know when the devil is trying to trigger it. And he will wait to trigger it until such a time as needed. He won't necessarily do it all the time. He won't necessarily keep you oppressed all the time. He won't keep you depressed all the time. He won't keep you afraid all the time. He won't keep you on your toes. He'll let you ride especially until you decide you're going to do something for God. Until you're going to go a next level, another step, or until God declares something's coming in your life. And that's when the attack will come. That's when the devil will look to your weak spot and try and manipulate it against you. You need to know that you have that spot, and you need to know that it's coming so that you're prepared to resist it. because oftentimes our fighting is not striking out at someone or something. Oftentimes our fighting is resisting the urges that are coming in us because of what just attacked us. You need to grasp that. Take that home tonight. We need to learn and understand. Oftentimes the fight is not the thing, the person, the situation. It's the resistance of what it's trying to make you do from the inside out. Fight that battle. Fight the battle inside of you before you try and fight the battle outside with somebody else. All right. Hope that helps you. We're going back into the book of John again. We're in chapter 18. Let's go to 28. It says, then they led Jesus. Ooh, time is moving from Caiaphas to the Praetorium. And it was early in the morning, but they themselves did not go into the Praetorium. Now, the Praetorium is in essence the place where the governor lives, right? That's his governor's mansion. They would not go in there because that would to go into an uncircumcised person's home would make them defiled, and they were just heading into the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? They brought him to Pilate. They answered and said unto him, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. A lot of sarcasm going back and forth here. Remember, John is around through all of this. Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him then according to your law. They said, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Very ironic that they would say that because they put people to death, right? Typically when they did it by stoning them, right? And as you've seen in other occasions in the Bible, it could happen almost spontaneously. Just like the woman they brought to Jesus and said, hey, she's an adulterer. Well, here's the first stone. What do you think we should do? Right? And so they were in and around it, but they want this to happen in a way that is quote unquote legal, justified. And so they don't want their hands to be on this. And so they take him really to Pilate so that their hands are not on this, and they can say, look, this was done under all kind of appropriate circumstances, even though we know it wasn't. So I was looking at a question that came up. It's a little bit off subject. Maybe we'll get to it before we get to the end of this. But let's keep going because our time has moved on me very quickly. So he says, Pilate answered I'm sorry, let me finish this off first. Therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by which death he would die. Jesus said that he would be crucified. He said that he would die, be hung on a tree. And that also is from earlier prophecies in the Old Testament, that he would be hung on a tree. And so it has to go through Pilate rather than go through the Sanhedrin in order for that prophecy to take place. If the Jewish leaders had known that, there's no way they would have taken him to Pilate, because there's no way they would have wanted to see a prophecy of his affirmed. So they take him to him, and he says, Jesus called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, are you speaking of yourself about this, or did others tell you concerning me? And Pilate answered and says, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. He says, you're a king then. Jesus answered, you said rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And Pilate said to him, what is truth? When he had said this, he went out again to the Jews. He's having a philosophical, spiritual conversation with this man who they think is worthy of death. And he says, I don't get it. I don't see anything here. I don't see any crime. I don't see where he's so destructive specifically that he should die. So he says, I find no fault in him at all. He says, but you have a custom. I should release to you someone at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews? And they cried again and said, not this man, but Barabbas. Barabbas. Now, Barabbas, as I've heard pronounced, was a robber. And so you know the story is extended out even further in some of the others, where they talk about this whole aspect of the surrender that takes place here. But here in this book, he continues to move on. So we're jumping now into chapter 19. I apologize. I just realized I didn't have the scriptures showing there, but we're going now into chapter 19. So beginning of chapter 19, so then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on purple robe, and they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. They beat him, they abused him. And Pilate went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." Right? I've scourged him, I've punished him for whatever you said he's doing or hasn't done. But the reality is, I don't see any reason for all of this. And so, isn't this punishment enough? Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." And therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." They want him dead. They want him off the picture. And again, they want both sides of the coin. They want him dead, but they don't want really to say that they were the ones that killed him. They wanted to say it was done under law, it was done by the Romans, we can blame them. Hey, it was a rightful thing to do, but if it wasn't, they did it. What can we say? They don't want their hands on it. And nevertheless, they're the ones that are driving the whole thing. Remember, this is happening overnight. It's happening in a very private area. The sun just started coming up now, and people are hearing, but nobody really knows exactly what's going on. Even as Jesus is being taken out to be crucified, some of them are still trying to figure out who it is, especially since he does not look the same because of everything that he's been through. So therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried, "Crucify him." Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." And Jesus answered him, "We have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." That made Pilate even more afraid. Now, in one of the passages, I believe in Matthew, it tells us that Pilate's wife actually had a dream about this man and asked, "Who is this man?" He says, "Look, don't do anything to him. I had a dream about him. This man is a holy man. You shouldn't touch him." And so Pilate, all the triggers are going off because he knows there's a problem here. He knows that they're playing up this situation for whatever reason. They want to get rid of him. He doesn't understand exactly why, but he knows this is unjust, but he's being cornered. He does not necessarily want to kill an innocent man, especially when he hears these things from his wife and from the people that he's claiming to be the Son of God. And you remember that the Romans don't believe in a God, they believe in gods. And so they never want to offend any God, right? They don't want any of them to be mad at him. And so he doesn't know exactly what's going on, but he knows he's caught up in the middle of a mess, and he doesn't want to be responsible for it either. So when Peter heard that, he was even more afraid. Verse 9, and went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus gave him no answer. Now Jesus does not speak for a moment. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" And Jesus answered, "You could have no part at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me has the greater sin." And from then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, see, Pilate's trying to figure out a way to not be in the middle of this. He knows something's going on. If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. So the Jewish leaders are using Roman politics against Pilate to say that, you know what, you need to do this. They have cornered him successfully into being the one who's going to have the issue here, right? He's the one that's going to be cornered in this situation. And so he runs out of options at this point, because either way he's in trouble. He can't, and he doesn't want to also appear too soft if this goes back to Caesar. So he's got a real problem here. He says, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought out Jesus, sat him down on the judgment seat in a place called the Pavement, in Hebrew Gabbatha. And now it was the preparation day of the Passover, about the 6th hour, which is about noon. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, away with him, crucify him." So Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" He's stalling. "We have no king but Caesar." These folks hate Caesar. They hate the Romans, but they're using the politics of it in order to corner Pilate into taking the action that he doesn't want to take, and they don't want to take either, but they want him to take it. So the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away. Now you know the rest of the story elsewhere, that he actually washed his hands as if he was washing his hands of it. He didn't want to have the blood of an innocent man on his hands. And so he allows the decree, but still doesn't want to be the one that says this is the appropriate thing to do. We're doing it based on your feelings and your impressions and your interpretation of your law. It's not me. I'm just allowing it to happen. So they're passing the buck back and forth. Now the latter part of this, of course, is the crucifixion, and he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of the skull, which is in Hebrew called Golgotha, where they crucified him and two others with him. And you know there's a lot more to the story as you read the other passages as well. One on either side, and Jesus in the center. Now, Pilate wrote a title, and it's interesting again that this is what John chose to highlight. He put it on the cross. The writing was Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Then many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. As I believe, if I recall correctly, this area is actually, when you get outside of Jerusalem, there's a main road and there's journey area that goes through. And we've talked about him spending time with Mary and Lazarus in Bethel. And this whole area is essentially together. It's not far. And so people pass in and through this area. They see this area. It was intentionally used as a public place of execution so that people would see this and fear the Romans. And so Jesus is in a place where a lot of people are walking by and they're seeing this this taking place and what this says. And it's written that Jesus is the King of the Jews. The chief priest, verse 21 of the Jews, said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but write, he said, I am the King of the Jews." They don't want to give him that position or him to be announced in that way as being the King of the Jews. We're saying he's not, saying he said he's the King of the Jews. Pilate refused to change it. And so again, it's a powerful statement that above Jesus, who is now on the cross, the statement above him declares, even prophetically, that he is the King of the Jews. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was without seam. A tunic is outfit you see a lot of times when you look at Romans, things like that. It's a 1-part garment, goes over the head and to the shoulders, and may have shoulder holes or it may be open on the sides. But it's a one piece, and it describes it here that it was without a seam. It was woven from the top in one piece, and therefore it was more valuable. They didn't want to tear it up like they did the other garments. So they said, therefore, among themselves, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled. Because it's in prophecy, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Again, you see John recognizing the prophetic and emphasizing the prophetic in this, but you also see Jesus without any control fulfilling prophecies. Now, I have been told in the past that there are over 100 prophecies throughout the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, that refer to the coming of Jesus Christ. I heard recently someone said that there's over 300. I don't know. There's 100 or 300. I haven't found that many. But I can tell you the concept of Jesus fulfilling prophecies that were from hundreds of years prior to his coming, and really in situations like this that are outside of his control. You're reading this one here about his garments being lots being cast for them, and we're about to read again about him taking a drink of wine. Again, these are prophetic words that were written centuries before. Jesus is not in a place to control all of this. We talked about a couple that he did specifically align with, as in the one of him riding in on a donkey. But when you think about the evidence of all the different prophecies that Jesus aligned with from his very birth, the location of his birth, all the things associated with that he had no control over as a baby, all the way to his death, where he has no control of how he's being killed. It's an amazing coincidence, if it's a coincidence, or it's a powerful testimony of who Jesus was. And John is sharing that. Verse 25, now there stood by the cross of Jesus, his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And so it's interesting. There's like 7 different Marys, by the way, that are listed in the Bible. Common name, especially in this New Testament time. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Again, the disciple whom he loved refers to John. Woman, behold your son. And then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. Interesting, because Mary had other children, other sons. It's interesting that that took place. In verse 28, after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. Now, a vessel of sour wine, again, this is a prophecy, was sitting there. Keep in mind, we've talked about this before, but wines, in essence, were used oftentimes almost as the equivalent of water, sometimes in place of water. Sometimes they were mixed into water because the water wasn't as pure as well water. And they believed that wine had the ability to help purify the water. So water and wine, or diluted wine and water, was a common thing that they would drink at that time. Sour wine represents it was not of the quality of some of the other. It was old, right? It was fermented. It was beyond. They filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on hyssop, and put it to his mouth. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. Bowing his head, he gave up the spirit. Therefore, because it was the preparation day, we already mentioned that this, when he was with Pilate, it was high noon, and the sun is going to be going down in a little while. So therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, and the Sabbath actually starts at sunset, not on the next day. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. Now, the purpose of breaking their legs, that does not kill them. But what happens is when they're on the cross and they're stretched out, they're using their legs to stay up, to breathe. Because the way that it is done, as they hang there, the arms are almost coming out of socket. But as they collapse down, it becomes difficult to breathe. It becomes difficult to move your diaphragm. And so they would push up on their legs to breathe. So breaking their legs didn't kill them, but it allowed them to die quicker because they, in essence, couldn't breathe. They asphyxiated. And so this was to make death more rapid so that they could take them down before the sunset. It would have been inappropriate to go into the Sabbath with dead bodies hanging up here or people still dying up here. They just would not do that. And so this was the purpose of this. And so that their legs might be broken, that they may be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who was crucified with them. But when they came to Jesus, they saw he was already dead. Now, we said that Jesus hung on the cross between the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, and the 9th hour. So after leaving there, so by 3 p.m., Jesus was dead. By the time the sun was going to be coming down, it would have been close to 6. Jesus is already dead. And they have no reason to break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side, and that's again a confirmation that he's truly dead. Immediately blood and water came out, meaning that they had separated, which means he had been dead for a while. And so it was a confirmation that he was truly dead. Now there's a spiritual element that we discuss. We hear it from time to time about the concept of blood and water. And that from him comes both blood and water. Jesus had told Nicodemus that he must be born of the water and of the Spirit. It ties to the water aspect of it. The blood ties to the anointing aspect of it. It ties to the fact that of the natural along with the spiritual. But in this particular case, as John is mentioning this, he's mentioning this as a confirmation and a witness to all that Jesus truly died. Because one of the stories that had been carried on was that Jesus wasn't really dead and that he had somehow been taken aside, healed back up, and that's how he, quote unquote, resurrected. but John is emphasizing the fact that he truly died. Verse 35, and he who was seen, has testified, speaking of himself, and his testimony is true. And he knows that he is telling the truth. He, third party, is talking to himself, so that you may believe. For these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled. Not one of his bones shall be broken. And again, another scripture said they look on him whom they pierced. So the scriptures, prophetic scriptures, again, outside of Christ's control. No one is instructing them to do this other than the Sanhedrin themselves. They're saying, can we get them done? So they go in and break the bones, right, of the others, but not him. And this aspect of piercing, a Roman soldier does it. So the word is fulfilled, but also the evidence is clear that Jesus is truly dead. The last few verses here of this chapter. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission to do it. So he was, again, a disciple of Christ, but he feared the Jews, right? So he came and took the body of Jesus. And Nicodemus, again, we see in the earlier chapters, who was of the Pharisees, but also a believer, who first came to Jesus by night, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes and about 100 pounds. And so they wanted to show, they weren't ready to step up and stop it or to die with him, but they did want to show some honor for him. And so now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So there they laid Jesus because of the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby. They had to place him somewhere before they moved into the time of the Sabbath. And so we end here on the end of this chapter, chapter 19. We'll pick up the last of the story on next week as we do chapters 20 and 21. We invite you to join us